Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UDOS podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about things that you do not know enough about. Today, I'm joined by Ama,
You?
and we're going to talk about climate change. So, climate change is a very broad topic, and we're going to talk about a specific aspect about it, which is about planting trees and the problems associated with it. So, before we go any further, let's just establish what's going on, right? So, long story short, what we have going on now is a lot of forest fires, deforestation, clearing of rainforests, and basically the number of trees in the world are significantly decreasing, right? I'm not here to talk about the science, but the point is that if you have less trees, the environment is going to go to a much worse state, right? One of the contributing factors to climate change. So, one of the solutions to solve climate change is ironically planting more trees. So, why is this very important? Basically, this is all the science I remember from bio class. I'm sorry. When you plant trees, trees absorb carbon dioxide. So, when they absorb carbon dioxide, they reduce the carbon levels in the atmosphere because carbon can like trap heat and make the world warmer. That's all I remember. So, that is why planting trees is very, very important. Now, we have established some rough idea, but Amma is going to help me with this. So, Amma, what exactly do we need to do in regards to like trees? What do we need to do to stabilize the global carbon emissions?
Right. So, Vishnu, let's understand one very simple thing first. There is absolutely no scenario in which we have zero carbon emissions. It is
Hmm?
impossible to happen. Be it in manufacturing, aviation, there's going to be carbon emissions in everything. So, the one way you need to stabilize it is to set a certain goal, first of all. And that goal in this case being to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero emissions essentially looks for allowing the removal of any unavoidable emission sort of by balancing it out through, there are a number of many
Mm,
ways that are applied in many different industries. But the one way to realize it the easiest is to plant trees because we simply don't really have any other way to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere. Planting trees is really cheap, really efficient. So if you look at the
yeah.
biology of the tree a little bit, right? We know that half of the dry weight of the tree is made out of carbon because they absorb carbon from the atmosphere, right? They use it
Mm,
to grow their branches, their leaves, so on and so forth, and they store that carbon in their structure. Now that is what's fundamentally going to reduce the carbon or CO2 in this case in the atmosphere, and that is what's going to reduce climate change. So now we understand a little bit of the biology of that. Let's look at what exactly has been done to achieve it. So there are a multitude of different like climate activists that you can look at online, but like some important ones involve the Bond Challenge, for example, which was started in 2014, where a number of countries collectively decided that to plant 3.5 million square kilometers, 3.5 million square kilometers of forest by 2030. They actually had a goal for
okay.
2020 as well, but I can't recall it specifically. But as far as I know, they are very close to achieving it. And then
Okay.
there is Ethiopia, which is a whole other level where they plant more than 350 million trees in a day, right? So evidently, what we can see here is that people are already noticing that you need trees. Plants are the solution to climate change. But like everything else, there are a lot of problems with it.
Yeah. So, as much as planting trees seems so utopian and like it solves everything, there are problems with planting trees, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, let's first understand what is the best way for trees to be planted or for trees to grow. So, the idealistic way for trees to grow is if we do nothing. So, let's just say we have like a barren land, right? And if we leave that barren land to just grow, to like just plants randomly grow, that is the best way to let the environment flourish. One, but two, that is also the best way to trap carbon. Basically, again, I'm no biologist or scientist, but forests are pretty good at absorbing the carbon from the atmosphere, right? And forests have like different types of plants, so that has something to do with how they're able to retain carbon. Again, I'm no biologist. I'll put a link in the description about how the economists talked about it, right? So what we need to understand is that forests are pretty good at taking up a lot of carbon. So let's talk about these initiatives of planting trees, particularly like the Bond Challenge and what Ethiopia is doing, right? The big problem with these initiatives is they encourage monoculture plantation. Mono means one. So monoculture plantation means that you're planting one type of plant. So why do they first choose this alternative? The first reason they choose it is because if you plant a specific species of plants that grows fast, then you can display your results very quickly. So, for example, let's just say I were to plant like 100 plants of bamboo versus like 100 plants of I don't know, some plant that grows very slowly, right? Like within a few months, the bamboo like grows tall, but my other plants do not grow fast enough. So it shows like as if my results aren't shown for the world to see. So that's the first reason why people prefer monoculture plantations when they do these planting initiatives. Second reason is, like always, people want to make money from everything. So even with monoculture plantation, there is some benefit that people want to get. For example, let's just say I were to plant a monoculture plantation of plants that can be used to make paper, right? So if these plants grow fast enough and they are good enough to harvest, I will harvest those plants. And when I harvest those plants, I will process the bark of the tree or the wood in general to make paper. And this whole processing of the plant from being a tree to become a paper, and then to be used by someone, and then to be thrown in the waste bin, and then to be like in a landfill, all of this will end up releasing even more carbon into the atmosphere for the whole processing and the usage of the tree itself. So what I'm trying to say here is this. The second thing that's important to note is monoculture plantation, people who do it try to monetize it in some shape or form. And the sad reality is that when they try to monetize it as well, the carbon emission still exists and it's not positive. Sorry, it is positive. That's a bad thing. Number three. So remember how I talked about how forests are pretty good at like capturing carbon from like the atmosphere, right? When we compare monoculture plantations to forests, the ability for a monoculture plantation to like capture carbon from the atmosphere is 14 times smaller than what a forest can do. So forest is like 14 times more powerful in terms of capturing carbon from the atmosphere. So monoculture plantations don't do the job because remember, the problem is that there's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. And if monoculture plantations suck at doing that, then their purpose is futile. So this brings us to talk about the next thing. So Amar, what happens if monoculture plantation sucks?
So here's the thing. You have a lot of countries that pledge to plant a certain amount of green or to do certain amount of bring certain amount of climate change, right? But the truth is when you use monoculture plantations, you're not it's really a lot less than it seems, right? Vishnu, picture you're driving down south in Malaysia, right? We'll take a Malaysian analogy, right? Picture you're driving down south. The only thing you will see anywhere in sight is palm oil. That is all you will see. Palm oil everywhere. Now, say for example, this palm oil has a certain lifespan, and for that lifespan, it absorbs the carbon. And then the farmer or whoever cuts it down to plant it again to begin the next harvest, right? It's like you said, carbon just released back into the atmosphere. All that green doesn't really contribute much at all, right? Into the entire concept of reducing the carbon in the atmosphere. So it really, even though you're saying, I'm going to pledge to plant this certain amount of whatever monoculture plant, it's not having as significant of an effect as forests. So this is where some countries have done this movement, particularly Ireland, for example, where they had a number of monoculture plantation and they pledged to lower carbon emissions to less than 5%. But what ended up happening was that they only lowered it by 5%. So from 30% to 25%.
What a scam.
What a scam. Right? So, and this is where social movements come into play that actually pressure the government into trying to cancel monoculture plantations or trying to push towards more biodiverse environments for these things to take place. But aside from just capitalistic gains, there are a number of reasons that countries would want to plant more trees. And the primary one being to avoid penalties. So the EU, for example, has a clause where you need to plant a certain amount of trees or you'll get fined or reduce a certain amount of carbon emissions. It's similar to the Paris Agreement, but the concept stays the same. So a lot of countries do that. A lot of corporations do that. Another reason why monoculture plantations don't really work is that because, like you said, they are used for capitalistic gains. Want to grow fast, want to grow good, use
Yeah.
fertilizer. Production of fertilizer, distribution of fertilizer, the actual use of it, all
Usage.
of it
Yeah.
releases carbon into the atmosphere. Like more carbon than you would if you wouldn't. So that's completely out, right? Now
Mhm.
let's talk about the actual population within these monoculture plantations. Now you have a set amount of land, right?
Mhm.
And you plant your, say for example, let's say palm oil, right? Now because they are planted so closely together, I'm sure we've learned this in bio before. You know how in forests there are taller trees, that taller trees get more sunlight than shorter trees that are
Yeah.
below them. The same concept applies here. Because they're so densely packed, anything below them cannot really grow, right? There's less light for them. So
Mhm.
there's not really good for biodiversity. And it's like you said, when we're trying to regrow forests and trying to reduce carbon as much as possible, we need biodiversity. We need to create a habitat, a proper ecosystem, right? So that lack of light and that lack of diverse biodiversity affects all the surrounding creatures, right? All the surrounding plants, animals, everything. So all of this sort of points towards monoculture being purely a capitalistic gain rather than anything to really help out the environment. You know, so that's on regards to that. But the question is, how exactly would you help using planting trees? Because you can have a little bit of hand in it. So what do you think we could do?
So, okay, so it's going to be important that as I talk about this, right, we need to establish how monoculture is different from these initiatives in the first place.
Yeah.
So, the first initiative I'm going to talk about is like Ethiopia, right? So, I think just now we kind of bashed Ethiopia a bit for like planting a lot of trees and saying it's monoculture, but let's establish the difference. Or why it's important to plant trees in the first place. So, what Green Ethiopia does is like you have people who invest in Green Ethiopia, and what Green Ethiopia does is two things. One is they want to plant trees, but second is they want the local communities to also be a part of this initiative, right? That means your local communities are going to be planting a lot of trees. Um, that will be good for the environment in general, right? So the kind of trees that they do plant caters to the biodiversity of the area. So what I mean by this, so there is some plants that are planted for human requirement, for example, like agriculture, because obviously people need to eat, right? Then there's plantation just for the sake of the environment and allowing like the animals or the flora and fauna in that area to be able to inhabit that land as well,
Yeah.
so that all communities can benefit mutually from it. Kind of similar to what we talked about in trophy hunting, where there is some form of mutualism between all parties. Same idea here. Second thing, I think this is pretty cool. Um, a lot of women benefit from these initiatives because women start holding a lot of positions that are important. Maybe they hold positions where they are like the ones on the ground planting, or maybe they're holding executive positions in
Yeah.
organizing the initiatives. So what we can see here is that like a lot of women are participating in these initiatives in the first place. Even things like where they plant the plants, they harvest the crops themselves. So they're getting employed a lot,
Yeah.
right? Third is uh, there's now a communal initiative to protect the land and the forest, because now your people have planted the plants in these areas, right?
Yeah.
So which gives them some sense of ownership or identity that they have associated with that land.
Yeah.
So this is an incentive for like forest rangers to pop up in these areas. That means now you have people who are in charge of taking care of the land from being exploited by other people. You have people who have a desire or an incentive to be engaged with the biodiversity, to study the biodiversity, to be part of other NGOs, to work together, to collaborate. All of these benefits also exist, right? And the last thing is the skill set that they can get. So I did tell you about how women can like benefit from all these participations.
Yeah.
But the most important thing is that these people are not just planting trees for the sake of planting, right? Like it's not just about environment though, because when they also plant these trees, from the investment and the support of like experts that they get, they also become more aware about staying hygienic, about how to protect these plants, how to make money, what kind of executive skills do you need in order to maintain this initiative on the long term? What are the other fields that you need to study in order to help this biodiversity grow, right?
Yeah.
So what we can map out to you right now is that if initiatives were to be environmentally friendly and also at the same time take in consideration the needs of the community, you create a very beautiful environment for both stakeholders to enjoy. And the most important benefit we get at the end of the day is that now we have the stepping stone for the forest to regenerate itself. Because after some time, when you allow like the land to just grow as it is,
Yeah.
or you like planted the right plants, the forest will just take it from there because
Yeah.
the forest has grown by being the forest,
Yeah.
right? So that's why this initiative is like very, very important compared to just stereotypical monocultural plantation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned, because if you were to look at England, for example, they recently
Mm-hmm.
discovered that the Isabella tree was something that used to help upwards of reducing carbon emissions by upwards of 40%. So now there's another movement to try and replant them in their natural habitat so they start growing like they used to grow. And
That's cool.
yeah, and it's important to point out the fact that nature really has the power to do that. The best course of action in this case is probably to just let nature do it.
Yeah.
Plant the seed and let nature take its course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so not much need for human intervention there. The problem is that no matter how idealistic and how perfect this solution is, there are cons. The first of all is on the topic of funding. Now, we
Mm.
mentioned previously about how monoculture is essentially a capitalistic money making machine. And
Yeah.
because corporations aren't able to make as much profit from it, or any at all in some cases, funding is really difficult to get, first of all, right? Because in many cases, if you look at monoculture plantations, the amount of funding they get and the amount of profit depends on having a certain species. Right? Also
Correct.
has a
Correct.
marketability factor where you can say, hey, look, we planted 100 of these trees in like a day or whatever, so on and so forth, right? And that gives them a certain amount of advantage within their marketing sphere as well. The
Mm-hmm.
problem is that when you let the process of wilding or just letting nature do its thing, when you let that happen, you really don't know the total amount of a certain species. You don't have any set numbers. So that, number one, is less profitable if you're trying to make a product or sell a product. It's also much more difficult to market as sort of a philanthropic idea or
Right.
to push forward that narrative. Right? So that's very
Right.
difficult for big corporations to take part in.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily their fault, because yeah, sure, do have to make a profit, but it is a little bit difficult to get funding from them because of this, right?
Yeah.
And a second thing is directly related to this point of being able to make a profit, is that competition with monoculture plantations. These corporations, rightfully so, want to make money. Right? There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that if you want to replant same species again and again and again, number one is, like you said, significantly faster, right? And also,
Yeah.
another difficulty that people face is that with a fixed amount of money in monoculture plantations and a fixed amount of land, you can have that same process repeating again and again and again. The topic of
Correct.
not having care is a discussion that was brought up, particularly in the UK, where
Mm-hmm.
it is theoretically anyway cheaper to have a monoculture plantation because of the fact that creating or replicating that exact same biodiverse ecosystem is going to be more difficult, or even planting the seeds of it, right? That's another
Mm-hmm.
disadvantage there. The third one is lack of space, meaning lack of forest, because of both
Yeah.
development and whatever existing farmland already is there. And perhaps by far the most important thing is that it takes a significantly longer amount of time. Right? Which is also something we
Mm.
discussed earlier about how monoculture plantations are usually made to be a lot faster.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
the idea behind letting nature do this thing is very much in the right direction. It's just that it's difficult to implement if we don't have mass support. So,
Mm-hmm.
what can we really do to curb monoculture plantation, which we've already established as somewhat of a disadvantage?
So I think um, the best we can do, or the direction we should go for, is to just disincentivize monoculture plantation as much as
Yep.
possible. So how we disincentivize is to show that other alternatives are more interesting, they are more profitable, or they're more beneficial to like as many stakeholders as possible. So we're just going to touch on this topic roughly, because if we actually wanted to talk about it, it could take like another podcast session or another day, which is about like carbon trading, carbon taxing, or carbon payment. Basically, slapping a price on carbon. So let's just call it carbon payment for now, right?
Yep.
So carbon payment basically means that, let's just say I produce X amount of carbon, right? So if I were to produce X amount of carbon, I have to pay a tax percentage of Y. That means now for every amount of carbon you release, there's a price to it.
Yep.
So if you were to release too much carbon, then you have to pay a lot more money to the government or to
Yep.
whatever body that you're supposed to give money to,
Yep.
right? So if this is true, it's less profitable.
Yeah.
Now, so how is it? How does it become different, right? So now the goal is to reduce carbon emission. It's not to plant trees. It's to reduce carbon emissions. So let's just say a company is trying to, for some reason, become accountable and wants to take some initiative, right?
Yeah.
Monoculture plantation doesn't help you reduce your carbon emissions enough, right?
Mm.
So that means even if you were to plant these trees and you're like, oh, look, we're planting these trees, but it doesn't matter when it comes to the stats of how much your carbon emission is because
Yeah.
the offset isn't enough. So
Yeah.
from this, then, just letting the forest grow or letting wilding happen seems more palatable because if you allow the forest to just be itself, it traps much more carbon. So if
Yeah.
it were to trap much more carbon, then your carbon emission significantly reduces. You have like taxation, all that kind of stuff. Now, I know for most of you who are watching, you're going to talk about like, oh, but the carbon payment system, it doesn't work. It's
Yep.
useless. It's futile, right? That's for another conversation. But we're just trying to appreciate the idea for what it is, just for conversation purpose,
Yep.
right? But here's the biggest bottom line. I think the most important thing that if any of y'all were to take from this discussion is that planting trees isn't as utopian as any initiatives are trying to market it to you, right?
Yep.
Because if any companies are trying to plant trees, you got to remember these guys definitely have profit as their main priority. So what does this have to do with it? What is it associated with in any shape or form,
Yep.
right? So even planting trees can be a monetizing scheme by all these companies to cover their exploitation of the environment, their exploitation of human labor, just to look like the good guys once and for all, right? So if you were to take part in any initiative that plant trees, I think it's important to understand and be aware of the environmental consequences of planting those trees. It's not as simple as plant tree equals environment good. There's a lot more to it, and there's a lot
Yep.
more you need to understand.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that we'll have to find a balance between planting trees for the benefit of the stakeholders involved, yet at the same time having a significant effect on the environment.
Yeah, and it's very hard to tread that
Find
line.
that, yeah.
Very, very hard. So yeah, there we have it. This is our podcast session where we talk about the problem of just planting trees. The link will be in the description for our reference video from The Economist. Huge shout out to The Economist. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this video, click the thumbs up button twice. All our socials will also be in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.
Thank you.